The hangar lights flickered across a machine almost no American pilot ever flew into combat. A fighter that looked like a P-39 Airacobra yet was something far more dangerous. Its wings were sharper, its engine stronger, its climb steeper, and its body wrapped around a 37mm cannon capable of tearing tanks apart. This was the Bell P-63 King Cobra, an aircraft that the United States designed, built, perfected, and then quietly handed over to someone else. It never fought for the U.S. Army Air Forces. It never became their frontline fighter, and yet it fought in one of the most brutal arenas of World War II. Today, we peel back the classified layers of the P-63's real story, the secret testing, the political tug-of-war, the lethal frontline action it saw thousands of miles away, and the controversial nuclear mission that cemented its place in aviation history. This is the forgotten revolution of the King Cobra. In early 1942, the United States found itself fighting a war it had been unprepared to enter, on fronts stretching across half the globe. The shock of Pearl Harbor had barely settled when grim reports began pouring in from the Pacific. American fighters, outdated, underpowered, and outmaneuvered, were struggling desperately against the deadly Mitsubishi A-6M-0. Pilots returning from combat spoke of an enemy with terrifying agility, blistering climb performance, and a willingness to push dogfights to the very edge of physics. Meanwhile, in Europe, the Luftwaffe continued to exert lethal dominance. Bf-109s and FW190s harassed Allied formations with alarming ease. Air superiority, so vital for any hope of launching strategic offensives, remained elusive. American commanders knew they needed new fighters, fast. Yet the design bureaus were already overwhelmed, racing to meet production deadlines while trying to improve existing aircraft at the same time. The Army Air Forces were scrambling. The nation was scrambling. And so was Bell Aircraft. Bell, compared to giants like Lockheed, North American, or Republic, was a relative newcomer. Before the war, their experience with fighter design was limited to a handful of projects, most notably the P-39 Airacobra. It was a bold and experimental fighter with an unusual configuration, a mid-mounted engine, tricycle landing gear, and a powerful cannon firing through the propeller hub. But bold didn't always mean perfect. The P-39 had serious flaws. Flaws that became glaringly apparent in combat. The removal of its turbocharger crippled its performance at high altitude, leaving pilots at a disadvantage whenever the fight climbed above 12,000 feet. Its engine choices limited its speed ceiling. Its aerodynamics were temperamental. And in tight dogfights, especially against elite Japanese and German pilots, it demanded more from the pilot than many were able to give. Yet the aircraft had strengths, real ones. Its roll rate was excellent. Its rugged construction allowed it to withstand considerable damage. And its firepower was unmatched. A 37mm cannon, capable of ripping through armor and aircraft alike. In that imperfect but promising airframe, the Army Air Forces saw potential. Potential they desperately needed. So, early in 1942, the Army delivered Bell a directive that was equal parts challenge, command, and plea for salvation. Fix everything wrong with the P-39 and build the best low to medium altitude fighter in the world. The message was clear. They weren't asking for tweaks. They weren't asking for incremental improvements. They wanted a transformation in aircraft capable of turning the tide in the very combat environments where America was weakest. Bell engineers didn't complain. They didn't hesitate. Many of them worked through nights, weekends, and holidays, driven by a mixture of patriotism, ambition, and the fear that if they failed, the war might be lost long before victory could even become an option. One engineer described the atmosphere as controlled chaos, held together only by the urgency of war. Another said simply, "We had no choice but to succeed." And so Bell went to work hard. First, they strengthened the airframe, reinforcing critical stress points that had plagued the P-39 at high speeds and during sharp maneuvers. They refined the internal structure, improving rigidity while reducing unnecessary weight. Next, they reworked the aerodynamics. Every curve, every angle, every rivet line was studied. The wings were lengthened to provide greater lift and stability. The tail assembly was redesigned to improve control authority. The fuselage was reshaped for cleaner airflow and better engine cooling. They also ripped out the heart of the old aircraft and replaced it with something far stronger. Allison's new V1710-93 engine, a more powerful, more reliable version designed to deliver optimal performance at low and medium altitudes, the very battlefields the Americans expected to dominate. Internally, the cockpit was improved for better ergonomics. Visibility was enhanced. Systems were relocated for easier maintenance. The entire center of gravity was adjusted for smoother handling. Piece by piece, the old Airacobra began to disappear. Every flaw identified by pilots, every limitation logged in combat reports, every complaint filed by maintenance crews was addressed with obsessive detail. And slowly, over months of brutal redesign and relentless testing, a transformation took shape. What had begun as a frustrated attempt to salvage a flawed fighter became something far more ambitious, a complete rebirth. By late 1942, Bell engineers rolled out a prototype so different, so improved, and so advanced, compared to the original P-39 that the Army Air Forces didn't see it as an upgrade at all. They saw it as a new aircraft, a successor, a weapon forged under pressure, a serpent reborn from the failures of its past. The Airacobra was gone. A new serpent emerged. And soon, the world would know it by a new name, one that would become legend on a front where the West never expected it to fight, the P-63 Kincobra. The prototype XP-63 made its first flight in December 1942, lifting off from the icy runway at Bell Aircraft's Buffalo facility with a sense of quiet urgency. The engineers watching from the ground held their breath, not because they feared failure, but because they knew how much was riding on this moment. Bell had spent the past year tearing the Airacobra apart, rebuilding it, reshaping it, and refining it into something new, something sharper, something designed to survive the next phase of a world war within minutes of takeoff. The test pilots understood they weren't flying an improved P-39, they were flying something fundamentally different. The XP-63 climbed eagerly, far better than the Airacobra had ever managed. Pilots who had wrestled with the P-39's quirks were surprised at how responsive the controls felt. The aircraft rolled with a crispness that hinted at real dogfighting potential, and its newly strengthened structure allowed it to dive like a falling anvil, then pull up cleanly without shaking itself to pieces. But the most important change wasn't how it flew. It was how it fought, with the massive 37mm MM-10 cannon firing through the propeller hub. The XP-63 was astonishingly stable. Test pilots fired burst after burst, expecting the recoil to kick the nose off target, but the gun platform held steady. The Kincobra wasn't just a fighter, it was a precision weapon delivery system, something few aircraft of the era could claim. By spring 1943, after dozens of refinement flights and hundreds of design tweaks, the XP-63 had matured into a machine that, on paper, could outmatch early Spitfires, Hurricanes, Typhoons, and even several versions of the Bf-109. Its low-altitude power, structural durability, and concentrated firepower made it a potential frontline monster. Bell's engineers proudly presented performance charts showing climb rates equal to or above many Allied fighters. They demonstrated improved handling, better reliability, and a ruggedness that could withstand the brutal conditions of combat operations. The Kincobra was ready, or so Bell believed, but there was a problem. A big one. And it had nothing to do with the aircraft's performance. The U.S. Army Air Forces had already moved on. In 1942 and early 1943, America's strategic thinking had shifted dramatically. The war in Europe had become a high-altitude campaign, massive bomber formations pushing deep into Nazi-occupied territory, protected by fighters capable of meeting the Luftwaffe at 25,000 feet or higher. Dogfights, interceptions, and bombing raids weren't happening at sea level anymore. They were happening in the stratosphere, and in that fight, the P-63 had a flaw it could never fully escape. Its high-altitude performance still lagged behind. The Mustang, with its laminar flow wings and British Merlin engine, was rewriting the rulebook on long-range, high-altitude air combat. The Thunderbolt, massive and resilient, could dive faster than anything else in the sky and reach altitudes the Concabra could only dream of. Even the Lightning, with its twin engines, was proving itself as a terrifyingly effective escort and interceptor. The Army Air Forces weren't choosing between good and bad fighters. They were choosing between excellent high-altitude killers and excellent low-altitude brawlers, and the war simply no longer prioritized low-altitude, America-first designs. The Concabra might have been great, maybe even exceptional, but it wasn't the Mustang. It wasn't the Thunderbolt. And in the brutal world of wartime procurement, excellent wasn't good enough unless it filled a strategic gap behind closed doors. The procurement officers made their judgment. The P-63 would be built, yes, but not for the U.S. front line. It would not escort bombers over Germany. It would not duel with Me-262 jets. It would not fly alongside the aircraft that would eventually become American legends, and so, quietly, without fanfare, without press releases, the Army Air Forces pushed the Concabra aside. Bell was disappointed, but not defeated. The aircraft was too good, too refined, too specialized to simply abandon. If the United States didn't need a low to medium altitude powerhouse, another nation certainly did. That nation was already asking for more fighters, already losing thousands of aircraft on the Eastern Front, already flying the P-39. Airacobra in enormous numbers, the Soviet Union, they didn't care about high-altitude performance. Their war was fought down low over forests, rivers, trenches, tank columns, artillery lines, and burning cities. They wanted durability. They wanted firepower. They wanted something that could absorb punishment and still fight like a demon, and the Concabra was exactly the P-63's future. It turned out didn't lie in American skies at all. Its destiny and its legend would be written half a world away, in the frozen, smoke-choked battlefields of the Eastern Front. Just as the aircraft seemed destined for obscurity, a new buyer emerged, not a domestic one, not a traditional ally, but a nation locked in the bloodiest battles in human history. The Soviet Union, the USSR, had flown thousands of P-39 Airacobras with stunning success. Their pilots didn't fight high-altitude bomber wars. They fought vicious low to medium altitude battles over tank columns, forests, trenches, frozen rivers, and burning cities. And at those altitudes, the P-39 was a monster. Soviet aces racked up jaw-dropping kill counts using Airacobras. Even the top Allied ace of the entire war, Grigory Rechkolov, earned most of his victories flying one Datso. When they heard America was building a better Airacobra, the Soviets sent a simple message: we'll take everything you can build. And so began a secret, politically sensitive partnership. The United States would build one of its most advanced fighters and ship almost all of them to the Soviet Union. When the contract for full-scale Concabra production finally arrived, Bell Aircraft's factory in Niagara Falls didn't simply ramp up activity, it erupted into motion. The plant became a living organism, a thunderous industrial machine driven by urgency, innovation, and the pressure of global war. Rail cars screeched into the facility day and night, unloading mountains of aluminum sheet, crates of precision-machined components, and loads of raw materials destined to become aircraft that would shape the final years of the conflict. Inside the plant, thousands of workers, many of them women replacing the men who were now overseas, took their positions along the rapidly expanding assembly lines. From welders and riveters to inspectors and engineers, the line thrummed with synchronized efficiency. The P-63 was not an ordinary fighter, and producing it was far from ordinary work. The Concabra's mid-engine configuration, inherited from the P-39 but redesigned for greater power and structural strength, required specialized jigs and custom tooling. This wasn't a simple matter of bolting pieces together. Every major step in the assembly process had to be rethought. Bell's engineers built new scaffolding systems, rotating frames, and support rigs that could hold the fuselage steady while mechanics installed the engine. Behind the pilot, a layout that still puzzled many traditional aircraft builders. From there, workers mounted the long drive shaft running beneath the pilot's feet. It was an elegant engineering solution but demanded extreme precision. Any misalignment could cause deadly vibrations or catastrophic failure during flight. Dozens of inspectors hovered over each installation point, measuring tolerances down to thousandths of an inch. These weren't just machines, they were lifelines. The aircraft's signature weapon, the M1037M cannon, required its own complex installation process. Mechanics slid the barrel through the central opening in the propeller hub, threading it with almost surgical delicacy. The placement had to be exact. A fraction of a degree off could cause the shell to strike the propeller blades, an unthinkable scenario. Only highly skilled workers were trusted with these steps, and Bell's training program worked nonstop to ensure teams were always ready. Meanwhile, fuel tanks were fitted inside the wings, maximizing range and endurance. Armor plating heavy, hand-shaped steel segments was bolted around the cockpit to protect the pilot from enemy fire. Every plate was tested, stamped, and recorded. The Soviets, who had repeatedly complained about vulnerable American designs early in the war, demanded durability. Bell listened. The P-63's cockpit became a steel cocoon. Day by day, the factory pushed out more aircraft. Dozens rolled out of the hangar doors every 24 hours, glossy, streamlined, freshly painted, and gleaming under the factory lights. Engines revved and roared as test pilots performed ground checks, then took them into the skies above New York for shakedown flights. But despite all this work, despite the pride of the crews who built them, almost none of the King Cobras stayed in the United States. The flow of aircraft formed a river, pouring north toward the cold edges of the continent. Completed P-63s were packed onto rail cars and carried across the vast American interior to staging points in the Pacific Northwest. From there, they were flown to Great Falls, Montana, the start of the ALSIB route, the Alaska-Siberia ferry system. This was one of the most dangerous delivery corridors of the entire war. American pilots took the King Cobras into the air and guided them across the frigid, unpredictable wilderness of Alaska. Storm systems formed in minutes, engulfing aircraft in blinding snow and gale force winds. Runways were often nothing more than frozen mud and gravel, marked by oil barrels and flickering lanterns. Temperatures plunged low enough to crack metal, freeze hydraulic systems, and stop engines dead, yet the ferry pilots kept flying. And the King Cobras kept arriving. Once the aircraft reached Ladd Field near Fairbanks, teams of Soviet pilots and technicians took over. Many had trained specifically to fly American machines. Others learned on the spot. After a quick inspection, they climbed into their new fighters and set off across the Bering Strait, one of the most treacherous stretches of air anywhere on Earth. If the American leg was dangerous, the Soviet leg was worse. Siberian weather cared nothing for schedules or treaties. Snowstorms swallowed visibility. Navigation beacons failed. Mountains lurked beneath cloud layers, waiting for pilots to descend a few feet too far. Planes went missing. Planes went down. Some pilots survived. Many did not. But still, the King Cobras arrived in the thousands. Despite everything, they came to the Soviet Union desperate for modern fighters to replace losses the world could scarcely imagine. The P-63 was more than a new aircraft. It was relief. It was power. It was hope delivered on aluminum wings. Mechanics marveled at its engineering. Pilots praised its ruggedness. Commanders admired its reliability and ferocious firepower. In frontline squadrons that had been flying patched up Yukon South and cobbled together LAGG-3 South, the arrival of brand-new American fighters felt almost miraculous. To the Soviets, the P-63 wasn't just another Lend-Lease delivery. It wasn't just another tool of war. It was a godsend. Once the King Cobras crossed into Soviet territory, once the handshakes were done, the paperwork signed, and the aircraft dispersed to far-flung regiments, the P-63's transformation began. The Americans had built a highly capable fighter. The Soviets turned it into a weapon tailor-made for the Eastern Front. The first thing Soviet ground crews did was strip the aircraft down. They removed American radios, which they found unreliable on their frequencies, replacing them with rugged Soviet sets. They patched wiring, tested the hydraulics under extreme cold, and coated components against ice and corrosion. The landing gear was reinforced almost immediately. Soviet airfields were often little more than flattened dirt, frozen tundra, or rutted grass. Pilots joked that if your aircraft could survive a Soviet landing strip, it could survive anything. Then came the armor. Soviet mechanics added their own field plates, heavy, rough-edged, hastily welded steel sheets mounted around the cockpit and engine. Every extra kilogram made the aircraft harder to handle, but pilots didn't care. They'd seen yak and lag pilots die because a stray round punched through thin aluminum. Extra protection meant extra survival. And then the Soviets did what they were best at. They developed tactics that weaponized the P-63's strengths with ruthless efficiency. The King Cobra was not a high-altitude dogfighter like the Mustang. It wasn't meant to duel BF-109s at 25,000 feet. It was a low-altitude killer designed for the violent, chaotic terrain war that defined the Eastern Front. Soviet pilots created an entire playbook around the aircraft's 37mm cannon, a monstrous weapon that no Luftwaffe pilot could ignore. The tactic was simple and terrifying. Step 1, dive, hard, fast, steep enough that the horizon vanished. Step 2, close to point-blank range. Soviet pilots said firing the 37mm from too far away was pointless. The cannon kicked like a mule and dropped rounds quickly. But up close, one hit could shear a wing off a FW190. One hit could shred armor on a German supply truck. One hit could turn a RU-87 or RU-88 into a fireball, and two hits could crack open a Panzer like a tin can. Supporting this cannon were the King Cobra's heavy machine guns, 2 synchronized, 50 calibers in the nose and 2 more in the wings. These guns had a devastating effect on infantry formations, soft-skinned vehicles, and retreating columns. When Soviet armored spearheads broke through German lines in 1944 and 1945, P-63s often flew ahead of the tanks, tearing apart ambush before they could form. The Eastern Front rewarded fighters that could absorb punishment, dive aggressively, and deliver killing blows at low altitude. And in that environment, the King Cobra thrived. During the massive Soviet offensives of late 1944 Operation Bagration, Sandomierz, the push through the Baltics, the P-63 became an invisible workhorse. It escorted Il-2 Sturmovix during deep penetration strikes. It intercepted German reconnaissance aircraft trying to map Soviet movement. It strafed endless columns of German infantry and horses retreating west. The King Cobra's powerful engine, low-altitude maneuverability, and tight roll rate allowed it to weave through valleys, tree lines, and ruined towns with shocking precision. Many Luftwaffe pilots later reported encountering American fighters in places they shouldn't have been. Those fighters weren't Mustangs, they were P-63s. And when the Soviet Union began its final drive toward Berlin in early 1945, the King Cobra followed the armored columns across the Vistula, the Oder, and into the outskirts of the capital. German troops, desperate and exhausted, often mistook the P-63's silhouette for a P-39 and dismissed it as obsolete. Until the cannon fired. Then there was no doubt. Pilots described scenes where a single salvo from the 37mm tore open bunkers, smashed machine gun nests, or obliterated vehicles trying to escape on forest roads. The sound alone, the ripping thunder of the cannon, became infamous among German rear units. Survivors recalled that when they heard the Cobra gun, they ran for cover. Knowing that armor and concrete offered little safety because the P-63's combat use violated Lend-Lease agreements, the Soviets buried the aircraft under bureaucratic silence. Officially, it flew only training and home defense missions. Unofficially, regiments on the front lines were flying dozens of sorties a day. Their King Cobras returning streaked with dust, cordite, and oil. It wasn't until decades later, long after the war, that Soviet pilots began to talk openly about the P-63 in interviews. Memoirs and declassified documents, a consistent theme emerged. The King Cobra was one of the most dangerous, reliable, and effective aircraft they ever flew. It lacked glamour. It lacked fame. It lacked Western recognition. But in the crucible of the Eastern Front where survival depended on ruggedness, firepower, and sheer aggression, the P-63 was exactly the fighter the Soviets needed. It fought. It killed, and it survived, a secret war waged in silence, and won from the shadows. If the P-63 was so good, why didn't the U.S. use it? The answer lies in strategy. American fighter doctrine centered on high-altitude escort missions for strategic bombers. The P-63 was built for a different world, one of low, brutal, up-close combat. Additionally, the Mustang could reach 40,000 feet. The Thunderbolt could absorb battle damage like a tank. The P-63 couldn't match either. So the U.S. made a simple decision: use Mustangs and Thunderbolts everywhere. Send King Cobras to the Soviets, who could use them well. It wasn't a question of quality. It was a question of doctrine. The story should end here, but it doesn't. After the war, the United States gathered several P-63s for a series of tests at Alamogordo. These weren't ordinary tests. They were part of the early American nuclear weapons program. The P-63 would fly into mushroom clouds to collect radioactive samples, sometimes passing directly through the fallout plume. Bell's forgotten fighter became an unlikely pioneer of nuclear-era aviation testing. Many of these aircraft were so irradiated they had to be scrapped on the spot. Thus, the King Cobra, designed for dogfights, became a tool of the atomic age. To understand why the Soviets loved it, and why it's still respected today, we must look at its true capabilities. Firepower. The 37mm cannon was devastating. A single hit often meant instant destruction. Handling low-altitude maneuverability was exceptional. The P-63 could turn tightly without stalling and roll rapidly into diving attacks. Pilot protection. Armored cockpit plating saved countless lives on the Eastern Front. Durability. Its mid-engine layout allowed it to survive damage that would kill other fighters. Speed. The P-63A could reach 410 miles per hour. The P-63C reached 437 miles per hour, faster than many contemporary German fighters. Maintenance. Soviet crews praised its reliability, especially in harsh winter conditions where many aircraft failed. This wasn't a mediocre fighter. It was simply the wrong fighter for the U.S. and the perfect fighter for the USSR. After the war ended, the King Cobra slipped quietly into the shadows of aviation history. In the Soviet Union, the only nation that had truly pushed the P-63 to its limits, most surviving airframes were retired without ceremony. Some were flown for a short time in training schools. Others were parked in open fields until weather and time claimed them. A few were cannibalized for parts. And as the years went by, they vanished. There were no grand parades. No proud museum lines of preserved aircraft. No Hollywood films celebrating their victories. Just silence. The Soviets, always secretive about their wartime innovations, kept very little official documentation on what their frontline pilots actually did with the King Cobra. Most combat reports were classified. Many were never archived properly. And in some cases, pilots simply recorded missions under generic fighter support or ground attack roles, leaving the aircraft type unlisted. As decades passed and records were lost, the truth blurred. Meanwhile, in the United States, the aircraft faced an even stranger fate. America had never used the King Cobra in combat, not once. The P-63 performed beautifully in testing, outturning the Mustang and even outperforming early P-51 variants in some climb and maneuver trials. But doctrine, timing, and internal politics prevented it from ever seeing the European or Pacific fronts under American command. So once peace arrived, the U.S. Army Air Forces looked at the King Cobra and shrugged. It was a weapon they never truly understood. For missions they never needed, some airframes were kept as curiosities, placed into museums that visitors rarely stopped to admire. Others were scrapped without a second thought. Just piles of aluminum that had never fired in anger under the American flag, but among the right circle's aviation historians, test pilots, collectors, engineers, and especially Soviet veterans, the truth survived. Passed down through stories, interviews, and the scattered bits of declassified files, the P-63 Kincabra wasn't a forgotten relic. It was one of the most underestimated fighters of World War II, and those who flew it knew why. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't have the sleek Hollywood silhouette of a Mustang. It didn't have the mythical reputation of the Spitfire. It didn't have the brute, muscular fame of the Thunderbolt on the surface. The Kincabra seemed like a footnote in the shadow of greater legends, but in the right hands, when flown by pilots who understood its powerful mid-engine balance, its deadly 37mm cannon, its rock-solid high-speed behavior, the aircraft became something else entirely. A precision weapon, a tank killer, a brutal, low-altitude sprinter capable of ripping through enemy formations before they even realized what hit them. The Soviets figured out what America never did, that the Kincabra was not just a fighter, it was a battlefield scalpel, perfect for the brutal, close-range, high-intensity combat of the Eastern Front's final year. This is the great irony of the P-63 story. Aircraft are often remembered for what they symbolize: freedom, victory, sacrifice, technology. But the Kincabra's legacy tells a different lesson, one much deeper. The success of any fighter doesn't come from its blueprint alone. It comes from doctrine, right? Doctrine can transform an overlooked design into a frontline killer. Wrong doctrine can bury a masterpiece. Before it ever fires a shot, the Americans saw the P-63 as a less important cousin of the P-39, useful for training, maybe for homeland defense, but not worth combat deployment when Mustangs and Thunderbolts were already dominating the skies. To them, it was a puzzle piece that didn't fit their strategic picture, but the Soviets, they saw opportunity, they rewrote tactics, modified the aircraft, hardened it for rough frontline airfields, and unleashed it in a role perfectly suited to its strengths. And in that environment, the Kincabra didn't just perform well, it thrived. This is why. Among Eastern Front veterans, you'll sometimes hear stories whispered in interviews: a lone P-63 diving like a thunderbolt through a column of German vehicles, a Kincabra punching holes in armored convoys with its 37mm gun, a squadron using their speed and low-altitude agility to slice through retreating formations, pilots talking about how they trusted the aircraft with their lives, not because it was perfect, not because it was famous, but because it worked. The Kincabra was a fighter designed ahead of its time, trapped by circumstance, misunderstood by its creators, and perfected by those who inherited it. Its story represents a rare truth in aviation history. Sometimes the best aircraft never become icons. Sometimes the deadliest weapons never become legends. Sometimes the machines that changed battles leave behind no monuments, no preserved fleets, no polished museum exhibits, only the memories of the pilots who knew what they were capable of. Today, only a handful of P-63s survive. Most sit quietly in museums, admired only by those who know to look for them. A few still fly at air shows, their engines roaring reminders of a legacy almost lost. But those who study the war, those who dig deeper than the common myths, all come to the same conclusion. The P-63 Kincabra deserved far more than history ever gave it. It was, in every sense, a masterpiece that simply never had its American stage, yet found greatness on another. And that is the true legacy of the Kincabra. Asterisk. History is full of machines that were ahead of their time, built for the right war, but the wrong strategy. The Kincabra was one of them. Yet, where it was needed most, it became a weapon of unmatched precision and power. If you want more untold stories, battlefield technology breakdowns, and forgotten legends of the Second World War, make sure you subscribe to WWII Rewind. And tell me in the comments what aircraft, tank, or mission should we uncover next. The past is full of secrets. Let's uncover them together.